For many Americans, riding the bus or train to work every day hasn't been the norm in recent years. But as worries about COVID wane and more employees get back to the office, mass transit ridership is seeing a resurgence. According to an April 2022 study by the American Public Transportation Association, ridership has bounced back to more than 60% of pre-pandemic levels. One factor that's feeding into this rebound? Higher than average gas prices across the U.S. are pushing people to opt out of driving when possible. But this isn't an easy switch for everyone.
Transit's frankly pretty difficult to use in the U.S. What that means is, it doesn't operate that frequently. It's not as reliable. The coverage is not nearly to the extent of, say, the automobile network of the roadway network. So what that means is when something happens that might make it more difficult, or in this case, more expensive for people to drive, moving to transit is not most people's first option.
That's Bradley Lane, an associate professor at the School of Public Affairs and Administration at the University of Kansas. Lane studies travel behavior, policy, and challenges facing public transportation planning. He says sharp increases in gas prices have historically pushed commuters to use mass transit. A 2011 study he led looked at bus and rail systems in 33 U.S. metropolitan areas from January 2002 to March 2009. Lane found that every 10% rise in fuel costs led to as much as a 4% increase in bus ridership and an 8% jump in train use.
My opinion is that has taken longer to see with this price spike than what we've seen in other price spikes in the past, is because of a lot of our vehicle travel is a lot more discretionary. So some of the first responses are more likely to say, okay, well, maybe I'll only drive into work 2 days a week or 3 days a week this week, and I'll work from home the other 2. Or maybe, we won't buy this extra thing we were thinking of buying just because, we're spending a little bit more money on gas. Once you get sort of past that period and prices are still high, then you start to get to the point where people are sort of out of options in terms of what they can do, because there's really only so many modes of travel. Most people live too far away from something to walk or bike to it. Most people are very used to getting in their car. Most people trip chain, which means you don't necessarily go from home to someplace and back. You go from home to work, to the grocery store, to pick up the kids, to volleyball practice, and then back home. So prices have to be high for a little while before people really start to change or consider change and adjustment in their behavior.
And this change is slowly happening as passenger numbers on buses, trains, trolleys, and more tick back upwards. But this begs the question, what are mass transit departments doing to increase accessibility where service is lacking? Lane says that the geography of the U.S. poses some unique challenges compared to other countries.
One of them is urban areas in the United States are relatively low density. What that means is there just aren't enough people in most parts of U.S. cities living close enough together, close enough to a potential stop to make it worthwhile to put a bus stop there. We've had some success helping reinvigorate central parts of cities, older neighborhoods by instituting some form of fixed guideway transit and facilitating economic development around those. And those are very laudable efforts, and in my opinion, relatively successful efforts. But even their goals weren't necessarily to increase transit ridership. They were as much for the overall economic health of the city and of the area. And then the ridership benefits that came with that were kind of a bonus. But those are pockets of a select few cities. Overall, there just isn't the density and mix of land uses in most parts of American cities to make transit viable in any kind of format.
The vast areas of land across America make it difficult for everyone to gain access to mass transit. Development and operation costs are often too high to make new construction feasible. On top of this, some already running systems are forced to end routes with low passenger counts as gas and labor prices rise. Lane points out that these decisions typically affect low-income populations who rely on this service.
When you have to start cutting transit, particularly bus service, you almost always and inevitably impact the people who need it the most, the people who are most transit dependent, the people who are dependent upon public transit to get to their jobs. And so in addition to the equity impacts, and there's some real bad downstream economic impacts for the workforce, the overall state of the economy, and people's individual well-being.
On a positive note, there are some towns and cities that are eager to extend their transit systems to as many people as possible. Bobby Cisneros is the Deputy Director of Transit in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Ridership in the region hasn't quite returned to pre-pandemic levels, but it's slowly increasing. He outlines a free transit program that's currently in place throughout Albuquerque.
Here in Albuquerque, at the beginning of the calendar year, we implemented a program that we are calling Zero Fares. It's a pilot program where no one has to pay to ride any of our system right now. That'll hold true for a total of 18 months.
While some cities like Albuquerque have the economic resources to do this, not all communities are in the same boat. Some mass transit systems are facing several challenges, including low ridership, budget cuts, and fleets that are in need of big repairs or updates. Many agencies, including Albuquerque, are also currently struggling to find enough drivers to fill routes.
We're doing everything we can to continue to fulfill all of our routes and our obligation to our services. So currently, we continue to look for new drivers. We've upped our recruitment process, and we're just hitting the streets, trying to get as many folks on board as we can in anticipation for this increase in ridership.
Cisneros believes that passenger counts will increase in coming months as people look to save more money. Factors like inflation and higher-than-average gas prices all make public transportation more appealing for those on a budget.
First savings off the bat is gasoline. Wear and tear on your vehicle is greatly reduced. For example, the brakes in your car are used less frequent, so they last longer. Your tires last a lot longer. Just overall maintenance in general, it just saves you money all the way around. And some insurance companies, not all of them, but some insurance companies will actually offer you a discount on your auto insurance if you use mass transit. So the savings can be anywhere from $6,000 to $9,000 annually.
Despite these economic benefits, Lane says that big cars and endless highways have long been part of American culture, and this largely still holds true today.
There's still this notion of component of the historical American dream being that house in the suburbs, the white picket fence, the 2.5 kids, and then a house with 2 cars in the garage. And, the mobility, freedom of the open road, that's just something that is embedded in our culture in many places in the United States. And many people consider one of the components of the American principles of freedom. And you don't have that really anywhere else. It's, automobile driving is more of a status symbol in some places to the extent that it is idolized or looked at that way, but it's not nearly as embedded as it is in the US.
The reality is that public transportation is not accessible to all Americans. There are many communities where services are few and far between. If you're lucky to live in an area where it's relatively easy to take a bus, train, or other mode of public transportation, try it out next time instead of hopping in the car. Who knows, maybe you'll prefer it to driving. To find out more about this topic and our guests, Professor Bradley Lane and Bobby Cisneros, visit viewpointsradio.org. For more behind the scenes, search Viewpoints Radio on Twitter and Facebook. This segment was written and produced by Alex Winton and Amira Zaveri. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. Studio production by Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson. Coming up next week.
You thought that a particular child was going to break down in tears because they really were very close to Grandpa Paul. But it turns out that they just look at you, kind of mute, and then say, "Can we have mac and cheese for lunch?"
The difficult conversations we have in life. Then,
athletes, for sure, like at a Power 5 conference school where they are known, they probably want to maintain a certain image and they don't want to appear weak.
Understanding the mental illness epidemic that's plaguing collegiate sports teams. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.